Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The courtroom was icy cold, and the silence hung like a heavy blanket over every spectator. A young, elegantly dressed black woman stood before the judge, trembling but determined. He gave her a condescending look, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. "So, miss, who claims that her mother is?" He hesitated with a sarcastic sneer. "A general?" A burst of laughter rippled through the room. A few knowing murmurs rose among the crowd. The young woman felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't lower her eyes. "Yes, my father and mother served our country. My mother is a general in the U.S. Army," she said in a clear, firm voice. The laughter froze, as if the air itself were holding its breath. The skeptical murmur turned to uncertain whispers. Then the door to the courtroom burst open. A towering woman in impeccable uniform entered. Her gaze was direct, authoritative, and it tolerated no lies or arrogance. Every eye in the room followed her steps. Snickers turned to shock and hushed murmurs. The young woman smiled slightly, aware that power and respect had finally entered her fold. The judge paled slightly, unable to hide his embarrassment. The laughter had stopped. This time, there was no room for mockery. The sharp sound of the door slamming echoed through the room. All eyes turned to the uniformed woman who had just entered. She exuded a natural authority, each step echoing like a silent command. The young black woman sitting on the bench felt a shiver of pride run down her spine. Her mother, General Alicia Freeman, was there. The judge, previously confident, scowled. His mocking smile was gone, replaced by visible tension. He had laughed condescendingly a few moments earlier, thinking the girl was exaggerating. Now he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "General Freeman," he began, his voice trembling, trying to regain some semblance of control, I didn't expect." General Alicia Freeman raised her hand, cutting him off abruptly. Her piercing gaze swept the room, and absolute silence fell. Even the murmurs and whispers ceased. "I imagine the laughter has already stopped," she said quietly, but each word vibrated with unquestionable authority. "I am here not only to defend my daughter, but to ensure that justice is truly served." The young woman, Jasmine Freeman, felt a wave of gratitude and power wash over him. The lawyers, witnesses, and even the police officers present immediately understood that this case had taken a turn that none of them had anticipated. The judge, flushed with embarrassment, cleared his throat. "Very well, we will proceed seriously," he stammered, unable to hide his embarrassment. Jasmine exchanged a look with her mother. A mixture of complicity and silent respect passed between them. The teasing was over. The real battle was just beginning, but this time, they were ready. The courtroom had become a scene of palpable tension. The judge, still seated behind his imposing desk, stared at Jasmine with a mixture of frustration and suppressed fear. He had underestimated the young woman, and now the imposing presence of her mother, General Alicia Freeman, reinforced his discomfort. "Miss Freeman," he began, trying to regain his authority, "you claim your mother is a general, and yet," his voice cracked slightly, "you dare defy this court with such confidence?" Jasmine looked him straight in the eye. "Judge, I am not defying the court. I am simply asking for justice." Her voice was firm, measured, but each word echoed like a clap of thunder in the room. The judge frowned. He had hoped to intimidate the young woman with his questions and condescending tone. But Jasmine didn't budge. She took a deep breath and added, "Laughter and mockery won't change the truth. And I urge you to treat this matter with the seriousness it deserves." At that moment, General Freeman stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. "Your Honor," she said, her deep, authoritative voice filling every corner of the room, "I am here to ensure that my daughter is respected and protected. Any attempts at belittling or mocking her will be noted and dealt with according to the law." A complete silence followed his words. Even the lawyers present remained frozen, impressed by the general's stature and authority. The judge, pale and disconcerted, stammered a few incoherent words before clumsily correcting himself. Jasmine, sensing the tension, let a small smile play on her lips. She knew the judge understood. He wasn't dealing with a vulnerable young woman, much less someone who could be intimidated. What he didn't yet know was that the battle had only just begun, and that his own arrogance would soon be his greatest weakness. The tension in the courtroom had reached a fever pitch. The once self-assured and mocking judge now felt the weight of General Freeman's authoritative gaze weighing on his every move. His pen trembled slightly in his hand, and his notes suddenly seemed insignificant. "Very well, Miss Freeman," he said in a forced voice, trying to regain control, "you say your mother is a general, and that you deserve to be taken seriously." Jasmine stood calmly and met the judge's gaze. "Yes, Judge. But I am not alone. And I am not here to be intimidated. I am here so that truth and justice may prevail." The murmur in the room increased, the spectators sensing that something decisive was about to happen. The judge, red with frustration, tried to speak again, but Alicia Freeman intervened before he could finish. "Your Honor," she said, her commanding voice cutting through the silence like a sword, "I remind you that this court is not to be a place for ridicule. My daughter deserves respect and consideration. If you cannot guarantee that, then perhaps we should consider having another judge preside over this case." The room froze. Even the defense attorneys were stunned by the general's strength and confidence. The judge tried to protest, but his words hung in the air. Everyone in the audience could see that he had lost all control of the situation. Jasmine felt a surge of inner satisfaction. She knew the mockery was over. She sat back down, straight-backed and confident. Her mother sat beside her, imposing and dignified, ready to intervene at any moment. The judge, now pale and silent, understood that this case would not follow the script he had imagined. Arrogance had given way to respect. And in that courtroom, the young black woman and her mother, General Freeman, had just reversed the power dynamic in an instant. The courtroom had returned to an unusual calm. All eyes were now on Jasmine and her mother. The judge, flushed with frustration and visibly uncomfortable, feigned an authority he could no longer impose. "All right," he stammered, his hands trembling on his desk, "we'll examine the facts." Jasmine stood up again, but this time she spoke to state her case clearly and precisely. Every word was measured, every sentence constructed to demonstrate the truth, but also to expose the contempt and mockery she had endured. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I am not here to create a spectacle. But I must point out that my rights have been repeatedly violated. I have been mocked, belittled, and made light of simply because of my skin color and the prejudices of some in this room." A heavy silence followed. The judge tried to interrupt, but Alicia Freeman stood up immediately. Her impeccable uniform and natural authority froze the judge in place. "Your Honor," she said in a deep, commanding voice, "my daughter is telling the truth. And I am here to ensure that justice is served. If this court cannot guarantee impartiality and respect, then I will personally request that another judge preside over this case." The murmurs in the courtroom increased. Even the defense attorneys seemed surprised by the force and clarity of this intervention. The judge, pale and bewildered, realized he had underestimated Jasmine and her mother. At that moment, Jasmine pulled a file from her briefcase. "I have all the documented evidence of what happened here. Testimonies, reports, videos, everything that shows we were treated unfairly." She placed the file on the judge's desk with quiet confidence. The judge glanced quickly at the documents, his eyes widening. Each page seemed to contradict his prejudices and reveal the injustice he had ignored. He realized, too late, that the mockery and arrogance had given way to a confrontation he could no longer control. Jasmine smiled slightly. She knew the hardest part was over. She had captured attention, commanded respect, and exposed the truth. But the battle for justice was only just beginning. The tension in the courtroom was almost palpable. The murmurs had given way to a respectful silence, mixed with palpable astonishment. Everyone present understood that the once self-assured and mocking judge was losing control of the situation. "Your Honor," General Freeman said, his voice echoing in the room, it is time to treat this matter with the rigor and respect that the law demands. The judge tried to reply, but his words seemed to falter and break before reaching the audience. He knew he had underestimated Jasmine and her mother, and now he felt the pressure mounting around him. The audience, made up of lawyers, witnesses, and citizens, watched every move with rapt attention. Jasmine stood and stared confidently at the judge. "Your Honor, I have provided you with all the necessary evidence. The witnesses are ready to testify. The file is complete. I advise you to take this matter seriously, as any attempt to minimize or mock it will be noticed and reported." The judge, feeling the weight of the entire courtroom weighing on his shoulders, tried to regain a stance of authority. But every gesture seemed clumsy, every word seemed to falter. Even the courtroom attendants exchanged worried glances. At that moment, one of the witnesses stood up to confirm the facts Jasmine had presented. His words, clear and precise, reinforced the impression that the judge had no control. The murmur in the room turned into a collective one. He was taken aback. General Freeman stepped slightly toward the judge, his piercing gaze leaving no room for error. "Your Honor, mockery and contempt have no place here. My daughter deserves respect and justice." The judge paled. His previous arrogance and mockery had backfired. The audience, previously passive, was beginning to feel the shock of the situation. Jasmine and her mother had reversed the power dynamic in a matter of moments. Jasmine sat down, a small smile on her lips, aware that this chapter of the legal battle had just tipped in their favor. The judge, now disconcerted, realized he could no longer ignore either the evidence or the quiet strength of Jasmine and her mother. The silence in the courtroom was almost crushing. Every gaze was fixed on the judge, who stood behind his desk, visibly uncomfortable. His arrogance was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. The mockery he had displayed at the beginning of the hearing had turned against him, and he felt the weight of authority and truth weighing heavily. "Your Honor," General Freeman began, his piercing eyes fixed on him, "it is imperative that you acknowledge your mistakes and handle this matter impartially. Any attempt at minimization or judgment based on prejudice is unacceptable in this room." The judge took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but his words seemed to falter. I understand. He stammered, unable to complete his sentence. Jasmine stood up again. She had carefully observed the judge's every reaction and knew he was now vulnerable to the truth and his mother's authority. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "it is not only my dignity that is at stake here, but that of all those who might be judged unjustly. You must understand that your role is to protect justice, not to hinder it with arrogance or mockery." The audience in the courtroom, including the lawyers and witnesses, felt every word like a clap of thunder. The judge, pale and trembling, looked down, unable to meet the gaze of Jasmine and General Freeman. General Freeman took a step forward, imposing and calm. "Your Honor, justice is not a game or a stage for your prejudices. You now have the opportunity to correct your mistake. I advise you to seize it fully." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The judge, aware of the extent of his own humiliation, finally nodded slowly. It was clear that the dynamic had changed. The young black woman and her mother had taken moral and judicial control of the hearing. Jasmine sat down, her expression calm but firm, knowing that the first step to victory had been accomplished. The judge, now forced to acknowledge the truth, had no choice but to submit to the justice he himself had flouted. The courtroom was now tense as a thread. The judge, visibly unsettled, tried to maintain an air of authority, but every gesture betrayed his embarrassment. Jasmine, confident, had placed a voluminous file in front of him. Each page contained meticulously collected evidence, videos, testimonies, official reports, everything needed to prove the truth. "Your Honor," Jasmine said calmly, "allow me to present the evidence in a structured manner so that this court understands the magnitude of the injustices suffered." The judge nodded reluctantly, unable to object to this clear demonstration. Jasmine began to present each element in detail, explaining the incidents, detailing the injustices, and highlighting the discriminatory behavior. Each revelation caused the audience to murmur. The spectators and lawyers present were increasingly shocked by the magnitude of the truth being exposed. The videos clearly showed mockery and humiliation, the reports documented the violations, and the witnesses confirmed everything accurately. The judge tried to protest, but Alicia Freeman immediately stood up. "Your Honor, you cannot ignore this evidence. Any objection would be futile and would only increase your own liability." As Jasmine progressed, it became clear that the judge had lost all credibility. His face betrayed shame and helplessness. Even the most skeptical in the room understood that the situation had changed radically. When Jasmine finished the presentation, she calmly placed her hand on the file. "There, Your Honor. Everything is clear. There is no more room for doubt, nor for mockery. Justice must be done." The silence that followed was almost deafening. The audience held its breath, the judge stared at the evidence without daring to challenge it, and General Freeman looked proud but calm, protective of his daughter. Jasmine finally sat down, a slight smile of satisfaction playing on her lips. She knew the hardest part was over, the irrefutable evidence had put an end to the judge's arrogance, and justice was about to triumph. The judge, flushed with frustration and shame, knew his credibility was now at an all-time low. But his pride refused to give way completely. He attempted one last maneuver to regain control of the hearing. "Miss Freeman," he stammered, I propose that we question some." He paused, desperately searching for a flaw in the evidence. "Certain claims and testimonies." Jasmine looked up at him unperturbed. "Your Honor, all the evidence is verifiable, every witness is available, and every document is authentic. There is nothing to question." The judge felt the pressure rising in the room. The murmurs of the spectators became more audible. Even the lawyers in the courtroom exchanged alarmed glances. He understood that any attempt at manipulation would eventually backfire on him. Alicia Freeman stood, imposing and calm, and took a step toward the judge. "Judge," she said in a firm, unequivocal voice, "this court is not a theater for your pride. Any attempt to divert attention from the truth will be considered an obstruction of justice. I strongly advise you to cease all maneuvering and focus solely on the law and the facts." The judge blanched. Every word the general spoke echoed through the room, crushing any pretense of control. He realized there was no escape, that he had to face the truth as it was presented. Jasmine stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said calmly but with quiet authority, "it is time to face the facts. Justice has no place for mockery or arrogance. My mother and I have been clear and transparent. Now is the time to act in accordance with the law." The courtroom held its breath. The judge, now completely unsettled, had no choice but to give in. His pride had been exposed before everyone present. Truth and justice triumphed, and Jasmine and her mother, General Freeman, now held undisputed control. The silence in the courtroom was almost crushing. All eyes were on the judge, who seemed unable to regain his authority. The murmurs had disappeared, replaced by a palpable expectation. After considering all the evidence, the judge finally announced in a weak, trembling voice, and taking into account the testimony presented, "It is clear that." He paused, searching for the right words, but General Freeman's stern gaze stilled him. "It is clear that the complainant is right." The word "reason" echoed like a clap of thunder through the room. The audience let out a collective sigh of relief and admiration. Jasmine felt her heart swell with pride. Her mother placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The judge, pale and with forced humility on his face, continued. "Any mockery, prejudice, or miscarriage of justice in this case is acknowledged. I apologize for any misconduct and guarantee that the law will be applied fairly." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Witnesses exchanged satisfied glances, lawyers nodded, and even some spectators quietly applauded Jasmine and General Freeman's victory. Jasmine stood up, her smile beaming and proud. She knew this moment was the culmination of everything she and her mother had been through: humiliation, ridicule, prejudice, all of it had been confronted and overcome. General Freeman approached the judge, her imposing stature and piercing gaze still present. "Justice is not an option," she said calmly. "It is a right. And today, that right was upheld." The judge, unable to answer, simply nodded. His moral and professional defeat was evident to all. Jasmine and her mother had triumphed, not through intimidation, but through truth, courage, and quiet strength. For Jasmine, it was more than a legal victory, it was proof that respect and justice could overcome arrogance and the most deep-rooted prejudices. The courtroom was now empty, the spectators having left, but the imprint of justice served still hung in the air. Jasmine and her mother, General Alicia Freeman, stood side by side, a sense of quiet triumph floating between them. The judge, humiliated and deeply aware of his mistakes, left the room without a word. His reputation was tarnished, and everyone present saw his arrogance and mockery turned against him. The lesson was clear: underestimating the truth and courage of others can have irreversible consequences. Jasmine took a deep breath, letting out a small sigh of relief. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered. "Without you, I never would have been able to face all of this alone." General Freeman placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "My daughter, you have shown courage, perseverance, and dignity. Today, you have proven that truth and justice always triumph, even in the face of arrogance and prejudice." As Jasmine left the courtroom, she felt the weight of her ordeal lift. She was no longer just a young woman mocked by a condescending judge, she was a respected force, capable of defending her dignity and that of all those who, like her, had been underestimated or discriminated against. In the days that followed, the story of Jasmine and General Freeman spread throughout the city. Their courage and determination inspired many citizens to stand up for their rights and never let arrogance or prejudice intimidate them. For Jasmine, it was a new beginning. The victory wasn't just a legal one, it was symbolic, personal, and profoundly liberating. With her mother by her side, she knew that no injustice, no ridicule, and no obstacle could stop her from now on. Justice had triumphed. Truth had vanquished arrogance. And for Jasmine and General Freeman, a new chapter in their lives had just begun, filled with respect, dignity, and infinite promise.